Would you like to grow apple trees, but you think your garden is too small? Maybe you just have a patio or deck. Or maybe as part of your landscaping, you want big pots with fruit trees growing in them. Well, this could be your answer. Join me today as I share with you how to grow apple trees in pots. Hi, I'm Gardener Scott, and this is an Ultra Spire colonnade apple tree. It's a very specific variety that's designed to be able to grow in a pot. And this is a Scarlet Spire colonnade apple tree. Now, both of these are columnar apple trees. They're very specific and ideal for growing in pots. Most of the apple trees you'll grow in your garden are standard trees, and they look like apple trees. You might get a dwarf rootstock that would enable you to grow a shorter tree. Well, these trees will grow not only short, typically about 8 feet tall, but they're not going to be very wide. They'll only be about 2 feet wide. So this tree, especially in a pot, will grow as a column. Pretty thin, pretty short, but loaded with apples. The key is how these apple trees have been developed. And as you look at the buds along the trunk of the tree, you can notice that they're only an inch, maybe 2 inches apart, much closer together than a standard tree. And these are not typical branches that will grow wide. Most of these are fruiting spurs, and these fruiting spurs may only get a few inches wide, but that's what's going to hold the apples. So with fruiting spurs along the entire length of this trunk, you can get a pretty big harvest in a pretty small space. I ordered these two as bare root trees. They arrived dormant. Some of the buds look like they're just beginning to wake up. But for me, in early to mid-spring, it's an ideal time to start putting these in the ground. So when you look for these trees, consider getting them at a time of year for you where they're still dormant and you can get them in the pot as soon as they arrive. The first thing you'll want to do after getting your trees is to put them into a bucket of water. Now, the trees have been shipped in most cases, unless you can get them locally. And so they're going to be in a plastic bag, in a box, and who knows how long they've been in that box. They're going to be dried out to some extent. So putting them into the bucket of water is a great way to rehydrate the roots. And while those roots are rehydrating, you can start thinking about getting the pot and the soil ready to go. Just like growing in any other container, the plants are going to need good drainage. So I drilled holes in the bottom of this pot. And I'm a big believer in hugelkultur. So at the bottom of these big pots, I added some cut branches, some small logs that will not only take up some space, but over time, as they decompose, they'll add nutrients to the soil. And in the meantime, they act as sponges during that decomposition. So especially for those of us in a very dry region, the wood at the bottom is a way to hold a little bit extra water in the pot. And then it's time to add the soil. Now, I would advise against using a basic potting soil mix. Most potting soil mixes are soilless. That means they are made up of either peat moss or cocoa coir, and compost and worm castings and a lot of other organic material. But there's no actual soil in that mix. And over time, those soilless mixes will decompose. And you can expect the level of the soil to drop dramatically in the pots. Well, since I'm growing these trees and I want them to last for a very long time, the last thing I want is for the soil in this pot to lose 50, 60, maybe even 70% of the volume. So I'm using native soil mixed with organic material. The mix for this pot is about 50% native soil, about 25% compost, and about 25% humus. I also added a balanced fertilizer as I was mixing all that together and then putting it into the pot. To give that extra little bit of water retention that I need in my dry area, I also added some peat moss. Peat moss or cocoa coir are great for water retention in the mixes that you use in the pot. Because I'm using actual soil that's been amended, I'll lose some of the volume in this pot as that organic matter decomposes, but it shouldn't be a lot. It should be so little that each year, as I add a little bit more compost to the top, the tree should stay at about the same level in the pot. As I was putting the soil in, periodically I watered very well. So a couple times as I was filling it, I made sure that I soaked it very well so that the soil is nice and moist before I put the tree in place. And then after that tree has set for about an hour, up to 2 hours in that bucket of water, it's time to go into the pot. After pulling the trees out of the bucket, I inspected the roots pretty well, just to see if there were any damaged or broken roots, which I could prune off. But these actually looked pretty good. And then I just move away the soil and set the tree in the pot. It's important that you want the level of the tree to be at least as deep as all of the roots. But most importantly, you want to make sure that the graft union, the point where the scion and the rootstock join together, is above the soil surface. Now, even though I have some real soil in here, I can expect that the level of the tree will probably settle over time as a result of the decomposition and just with a little bit of compaction that will happen with rain and snow. So this level with the graft point is going to drop. Expect that to happen. So by ensuring that you've got a good distance above the soil surface, this will always be in the open air, which is what you want. With the tree centered in the pot, I then spread out and covered all of the roots. And after all of the soil was in place, I gave it another very good soaking. So all of this soil would be nice and moist, and those roots go from the wet environment of the water to the moist environment of the soil and can begin growing. And then, as the very last step in this process, I mulched the surface of the soil. You don't want to have bare soil. The pots are naturally going to dry out faster than in-ground beds. The mulch is going to reduce that evaporation. It'll reduce the number of times you need to water because it'll help hold the soil moisture more consistent. Because these dormant trees don't have any leaves growing on them right now, there's really no reason to stake the trees. And by the time they start growing and putting out the leaves and those small fruiting spurs, the roots should be established enough and the weight of the pot should be enough that they also don't require any staking going into the future. Now, these trees are a bit more expensive than standard bare root trees that you might buy. But because of this special variety, this special type of tree, it's not unusual to get fruit in the very first year, definitely in the second year of planting. You may be wondering why I set these pots out in the open. Well, Like any other apple tree, they'll do better in full sun, and this is a great spot for them. And like all other apple trees, you need at least 2 trees, and these 2 varieties will pollinate each other and make sure that I get the fruit that I'm looking for. My garden plan calls for a really nice stone pathway through this archway to enter my garden. And so having these columnar apples here is really going to be a wonderful visual statement. In spring, they're going to be loaded with those wonderful apple blossoms. And then later in the year, they're going to be covered with the apples. And so for myself and any visitor to my garden, they'll walk through this area with these beautiful trees and then enter this archway that'll be covered with plants and flowers. And it begins right here as a little bit of an anchor point with trees in pots. So even though I got a very large garden space, growing trees in pots can actually make sense if it's part of your garden plan. If you don't have a big garden, well, it makes a lot of sense because you can have the fruit you're looking for in a pot. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.